The 1950s is the decade of radiation studies. During those years, the effects of radiations on organisms are investigated in the detail. One of the major effects of radiations was the induction of cancer. The other one was the limitation of lifespan due to unidentified or multiple causes. In other terms, when applied to a test population, radiations would reduce the mean lifespan as compared to the contrast population. At a very high dose, they would directly induce mortality, but at lower doses, they would have a proportional impact on mortality curves, namely shifting the curves of mortality to the left. But what is the cause? Is it by inducing a disease, several diseases, or by accelerating the rate of aging in general? The latter interpretation, championed by Saker, was dominant over the period, but it came later to be challenged by Strehler, another important figure of these years. The immediate cause of death is identified by Saker as many forms of physiological injury produced by the radiation. It is, therefore, unspecified by itself. That is, it is not producing death through a specific pathological process, such as leukemia. In Saker's words, accelerating pathological tendencies but introducing no qualitatively new pathology. Remember that the experiments consist in submitting the animals to enough radiation for an effect to take place, but not enough for it to produce immediate or almost immediate death. Initially, the idea was to study how much radiation an animal could stand without any effect or moderate effect. Then it becomes a study of the relation between dose and effect on mortality. Saker has proposed to model the process as an injury function combined with a lethal bound. In other terms, individual animals can stand a certain level of injuries until they die. Given that death is a hazard, individual death does not necessarily reflect the effects of radiation. However, in a comparison of test and control population, the effects of radiation will be reflected in mortality curves. Note that the mortality observed in exposed population will be a combination of natural aging, hazards, and radiation. An important question is how the effects of radiation combine with the natural process. Is it additively as an extra cause of death or multiplicatively as a coefficient for some of them? Saker postulated that it would be additive. He therefore subtracted the natural conversion curves from the observed curve and assumed the rest would be the lethality function from radiation injury. Once this is assumed, the observation is that there is an inverse proportionality between the number of units of dose rate and the mean survival time. This figure shows the relation. Saker proposed a general but very vague physiological interpretation of the effects of radiation. He proposed to see it as a series of hits that would disrupt homeostasis until the ability to get back to normal is exhausted. But this is exactly the same vision he proposed to understand aging in general. He says, the occurrence within an organism of a failure of function leading to death is the result of a fluctuation of the physiological state of the organism. The mathematical problem becomes one of determining how frequently such extreme homeostatic parameters of the organism or population. Saker does not say much more on the process and thus remains very cautious. At the same time, this lets the hypothesis remain very speculative. However, an implicit interpretation of the process of aging was lurking in the dark. The massive hypothesis that the effects of radiations were due to the effects of mutations, and that these, in turn, were similar to the kind of damage that would be observed in aging and probably would be necessary in cancer. This was explicitly advocated by Strehler in a 1959 paper. Aging consists in the accumulation of hits in genes. Our theory assumes, he writes, that the elementary step in the process of aging is an aging hit which destroys a chromosome of the somatic cell in the sense that it renders all genes carried by that chromosome inactive. The hit need not destroy the chromosome in a physical sense. We assume that the aging hits are random events and that the probability that a chromosome of a somatic cell suffers such a hit per unit time remains constant throughout life. At this time, however, the hypothesis was difficult to substantiate. Apart from large-scale chromosome aberrations, it was impossible to observe induced specific mutation. However, in a foundational paper in 1954, Armitage and Doll proposed the so-called multistage theory of carcinogenesis, which states that cancer results from a certain combination of cumulated mutations with time. The older one gets, the more likely one is to strike the unlucky combination of cancer initiation. Based on this hypothesis, they observed that curves of incidence of multiple forms of cancer and calculated that they were consistent with a series of 6 mutations. Yet it has to be emphasized that they could not observe these mutations. They provided a powerful framework that is still in use today, with some important additions though. This concomitant theory was undoubtedly inspired by radiation studies. It consisted in focusing on one of these unspecified causes of death, cancer, that could be aggravated by radiation. However, given Strehler's general framework, there was no reason to think that other age-related diseases, say atherosclerosis, would not result from the same kind of process, accumulation of mutations in other combinations than in the case of cancer, that would lead to a different type of progressively dysfunctional state. In that way, aging itself could be defined as an accumulation of mutations, some combinations of which produce specific age-related diseases, among which cancer. In 1959, another important figure in the field, Strehler, questioned both theories. First, Strehler provided an explicit framework to think of aging as an accumulation of defects. All changes affecting the fitness of organisms are basically changes in the kinds, amounts, or arrangements of molecules and cells. Changes with age arise either from stochastic changes or from genetic processes, and should satisfy 4 criteria: universality, intrinsicality, progressiveness, and deleteriousness. The evolutionary origin of the aging process and the nature of the possible sources of instability afford evidence that there are multiple causes of aging. It is not at present possible to assign relative weights to the various processes. Note that he distinguishes 2 general sources of such defects: stochastic or extrinsic, and genetic or intrinsic. See the module on biodemography. He is also clear about 4 criteria that would make a process an instance of aging: universality, all individuals of a species should age; intrinsicality, they age independently of environmental injuries; progressiveness, the process takes time; and deleteriousness, it does not improve but worsens the functional condition of the organism. In the end, he proposes that in spite of all the possible causes, They would bottleneck into these changes with age. But Strehler clearly does not express the view that all the deleterious effects of aging are primarily on genes. That said, is radiation mimicking the process itself? In other terms, does it really accelerate aging as Zaker claimed? Strehler provides 4 arguments against this hypothesis. First, Strehler says that time and radiation are unlikely to produce their de-adaptive effects by similar mechanisms. The first reason is that aging and radiation do not affect the same cells in the same proportion. The major effect of time is on post-mitotic cells, while the major effect of low-dose radiation is on dividing cell lines, what we would call stem cells today. Mutations, in other terms, do not occur in the same compartment of cells in a tissue. The second reason is precisely that radiation damage is primarily genetic, whereas time produces many kinds of changes, most of which are probably not genetic. In other terms, there is a positive reason not to embrace the genetic theory of aging. Not because it is wrong, but because it is probable that there are other causes of aging as well. Not all degradations in post-mitotic dysfunctional aging cells would be caused by defective genes. The third reason is that in tested populations submitted to radiation, some individuals survive for as long as in control populations, even when exposed to high doses. Given that radiations will necessarily induce mutations in dividing cells, they show that there is no direct link between accumulation of mutation and accelerated functional degradation. The fourth and last reason is that radiation dosages sufficient to double the rate of mortality increase produce a much greater than 2-fold increase in genetic effects, mutations. In other words, the amount of genetic damage is not proportional to the rate of mortality induced, suggesting that radiations also produce other forms of damage, or that these damages can be repaired or compensated to some extent. The general question at stake in this debate would not be phrased in the same terms anymore. However, the conceptual debate has remained. On the one hand, aging can be interpreted as the sum of all damages, including the ones that we group together and identify as diseases, as well as unspecified damages that lead to functional decline. This is Zaker's view. It is consistent with Armitage and Doll's views of the effect of time on cancer. Aging is nothing more. We could call this view the contingentist view of aging, a suggestion made by philosopher Anouk Barberousse in a personal communication. On the other hand, one can conceive of aging as a process that would go beyond the accumulation of hits. Then there is a second question. It concerns the role of genetic damage in the process of aging. In a way, Zaker assumed that genetic damage summarized the process of aging. Strehler, on the other hand, emphasized the existence of other forms of damage that would also account for the degradations observed in aging. Radiation studies has played a major role in casting some debates in biogerontology. Surprisingly enough, while most of the presuppositions are considered to be outdated, the debates still remain the same.